Hey guys, tonight we begin with a complicated question. Have you ever surprised what were the execution methods exist in medieval times? Like current justice system and execution or other? So now we are going to discuss about this myth. Before we begin journey, take a moment to like the video, but subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy my video. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval execution methods could be grand spectacles designed to both inflict pain and send a message to those who witness them. Medieval justice was often as much theatre as it was punishment. Public execution methods served multiple purposes as they simultaneously allowed the community to satisfy its demand for retribution, demonstrated the power of the state, and provided a warning to future criminals. The most severe punishments were reserved for the greatest crimes, ones that ruptured the sense of social order. The punishments imposed for these crimes were designed to be as prolonged and agonizing as possible to match the heinousness of the crime. Depicted at the climax of the film Braveheart, the process of hanging, drawing, and quartering was a long and drawn-out process designed to make the condemned suffer as much pain and humiliation as was physically possible. Reserved for traitors, the execution was multiple punishments stacked on top of each other. First, the prisoner would be dragged by a horse through the streets of the city to suffer abuse by the common people. Once arriving at the execution site, the prisoner was lifted up to hang by the neck. This was not a short, sharp drop designed to break the neck. Rather, it was a slow strangulation meant to drag out suffering. Before the condemned fell unconscious or died, they were lowered back down to the scaffold. Unfortunately for them, their torment was only just beginning. They were then tied to a table, and a large brazier was lit next to them. With a sharp knife, the executioner would open them up from the sternum down to the groin. They would then reach into the torso, pull out the various organs, and toss them into the fire. The condemned would be kept alive and conscious through the whole ordeal, forced to see their innards removed and smell their own burning organs. When there was nothing left to remove, the condemned was beheaded. One final humiliation lay in store for the body, however, as it was chopped up into 4 pieces. The head would be placed on a pike, and the quarters of the body would be sent to the 4 corners of England as a reminder of what treason against the king brought. The breaking wheel. In use across Europe from antiquity through the 19th century, the breaking wheel was a punishment for murderers, rapists, traitors, and highwaymen that provided a grisly spectacle often lasting multiple days. The exact details of the execution varied from place to place, but each variation followed the same template. The condemned would have their legs and arms broken and laced through the spokes of a large cartwheel. In France, this was accomplished by tying the condemned to the wheel, rotating it around, and as each limb passed, the executioner would strike it with a heavy metal bar. In the Holy Roman Empire, the limbs were often broken by being crushed by the heavy wheel itself. If the executioner was instructed to show mercy, he could behead the condemned after 1 or 2 limbs were broken. Once the broken and shattered limbs were tied around the wheel spokes, the wheel would be hoisted up on top of a large pole for all to see. Like the ancient practice of crucifixion, it would often take a while for death to claim the wheel's victim. The unfortunates would slowly succumb to the elements, their wounds, and the various animals that would come looking for an easy meal. In 1348, a man named Bona Dies supposedly remained conscious for 4 days afterwards. In 1581, Christmann Janipatinga, a German serial killer, was said to have lasted 9 days before dying. Burning. Most famously used in cases of heresy and witchcraft, burning was also employed as a punishment for treason, arson, and a handful of other serious crimes throughout the medieval period. For heretics, burning was both practical and symbolic. Fire often takes on a cleansing property in Christian thought, with purgatory being described as a cleansing fire. In addition, with the body totally reduced to ashes, there would be no relics from the heretic that could be collected by any remaining followers of the heresy. Interestingly, burning was seen as a more modest punishment for women accused of treason. Hanging, drawing, and quartering required the condemned be stripped naked, which was seen as too great a humiliation for women. Burning allowed the condemned to remain clothed while still suffering unimaginable pain. Impalement. Infamously used as a terror tactic in warfare by Vlad III of Wallachia, impalement was also used as a form of judicial punishment. There were 2 types of impalement practiced. The first, known as transversal impalement, would involve a spike being thrust through the stomach or back, resulting in the victim lying horizontally across the pole. The second, known as longitudinal impalement, would involve the spike being driven up vertically through the torso. The victim would then be left on the spike to slowly die from a combination of exposure and massive blood loss. Boiling. Part of the horror of seeing someone boiled alive comes from the fact that the action is used so ordinarily for cooking. A pot full of bubbling liquid is something most people will see every day. That everyday scene was suddenly inverted when a person was thrown into the pot. Boiling alive was the punishment for coin forgery in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, but its actual use there is not well documented. However, there is solid evidence of boilings that took place in the 1500s. A notorious example was the case of a man named Richard Roos. He was a cook who confessed to trying to poison Bishop John Fisher in 1532. King Henry VIII was so horrified by the crime that a new law was hastily pushed through Parliament that classified poisoning as a treasonous offence and specified death by boiling as the punishment. The law was specifically written to retroactively apply to Roos. In April of 1532, he was marched to his place of execution. He was chained up and suspended over a cauldron of boiling water. He was dunked into the cauldron, left to suffer, and then removed. The whole process was repeated 3 separate times, and his death reportedly took 2 hours. Roos said he had no co-conspirators and acted alone. However, as Bishop Fisher was a firm opponent of Henry Wotyete's attempts to receive an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, some historical conspiracy theorists suspect that Henry himself had something to do with the attempt on Fisher's life. Flaying. Flaying is the process of removing the skin from the muscle beneath. Extensively practiced in the ancient world, it was used sparingly in the medieval period. Saint Bartholomew was often depicted holding his own skin in Christian artwork, as that was his method of martyrdom according to his hagiography. The most well-known case of someone being flayed was the case of Bertrand de Gourdon. He had shot and killed King Richard the Lionheart of England in 1199. While the king forgave and pardoned him on his deathbed, the mercenary leader Mercadier, who was employed by Richard, was not as keen to let the young man get away with regicide. He dragged Bertrand back to camp and ordered him to be flayed alive. The flayer would start at the extremities, like the hands or feet, and slowly slice the skin away with a sharp knife, moving in toward the torso. The ultimate goal of flaying was to be able to remove the victim's skin and have it remain in one piece for the maximum visual impact. This was a procedure that many would have experienced with performing on animals, as the removal of skin was necessary for the production of leather. Blood eagle. The blood eagle was a spectacular form of ritual execution performed by the Vikings during the early medieval period. Many modern scholars debate whether the execution method was actually performed at all, or was just a literary flourish. The victim would be bound and laid face down with their back exposed. The executioner would then make a long incision down the back and pull apart the skin and muscle to expose the spine and rib bones. Each rib bone would then be broken and torn away from the spinal column to expose the inside of the torso. The next step is where the procedure gets its avian moniker. The lungs would then be taken out of the cavity and splayed on the victim's back to resemble wings. In 867, Ella, the king of Northumbria and the killer of Ragnar Lothbrok, was captured by the great heathen army. It was written in the sagas that Ragnar's kinsmen carved the bloody eagle on his back. Thus was Ragnar's death avenged, and the terror of resisting the Northmen spread among the English. Lingchi. Medieval Europe did not have a monopoly on brutal executions. In China, the highest form of punishment was lingchai, which translates to slow slicing. In English, it is better known as death by 1,000 cuts. The punishment was reserved for what was seen as the worst crimes imaginable against both the state and against nature. These included the murder of one's lord or one's parents. Lingchai was, as the name suggests, a deliberately slow death. The victim was tied to a pole, and the executioner would grab hold of the flesh at different parts of the body before slicing it off. The process would start at the extremities and work its way in towards the torso. After great chunks of the victim's flesh had been cut away, the amputations would begin. Again, these started at the hands and feet and then worked their way in. The gruesome process was actually banned several times throughout Chinese history, as it was seen as too extreme to be allowed in a moral society. Silk is a fabric first produced in Neolithic China from the filaments of the cocoon of the silkworm. It became a staple source of income for small farmers and, as weaving techniques improved, the reputation of Chinese silk spread so that it became highly desired across the empires of the ancient world. As China's most important export for much of its history, the material gave its name to the great trading network the Silk Road, which connected East Asia to Europe, India, and Africa. Not only used to make fine clothes, silk was used for fans, wall hangings, banners, and as a popular alternative to paper for writers and artists. Silk is produced by silkworms to form the cocoon within which the larvae develop. A single specimen is capable of producing a 0.025 mm thick thread over 900 meters long. Several such filaments are then twisted together to make a thread thick enough to be used to weave material. Fabrics were created using looms, and treadle-operated versions appear in, for example, the murals in tombs of the Han Dynasty. The silk could be dyed and painted using such minerals and natural materials as cinnabar, red ochre, powdered silver, powdered clamshells, and indigo, and other inks extracted from vegetable matter. Sericulture. That is the cultivation of mulberry leaves, the tending of silkworms, the gathering of threads from their cocoons, and the weaving of silk. First appears in the archaeological record of ancient China c. 3600 BCE. Excavations at Hemudu in Zhejiang province have revealed Neolithic tools for weaving and silk gauze. The earliest known examples of woven silk date to c. 2700 BCE and come from the site of Qianshanyang, also in Zhejiang. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that the Indus Valley civilization in the north of the Indian subcontinent was also making silk contemporary with the Neolithic Chinese. They used the Anthorea moth to produce silk threads for weaving. However, silk production on a large scale and involving more sophisticated weaving techniques would only appear from the Chinese Shang and Zhou dynasties in the 2nd millennium BCE. Silk then became one of the most important manufactured and traded goods in ancient China, and finds of Shang dynasty silk in an Egyptian tomb are testimony to its esteemed value and use in early international trade. It was not long after the discovery of silk that the fabric became a status symbol. The creation of silk fabrics requires a lot of labor and resources, so silk was precious and valuable. At first, only the emperor, his close family, and high-ranking military officials were allowed to wear silk garments. However, these rules were later relaxed during the Qing dynasty. After the Qing dynasty, anyone was allowed to wear silk clothing, from royalty to peasants. However, in reality, you were unlikely to see most people of society's lower classes wearing silk, as it remained a costly fabric. Silk was so valuable in ancient China that for a while, it was even used as a currency. During the Han Dynasty, government employees were paid their salaries in silk, and farmers had to pay their taxes in grain and silk. Monks who broke their monastery's rules even had to pay their fines in silk. At the time, the price of something could be described in the lengths of silk as a unit of measurement. The emperor and Chinese government officials also used silk as diplomatic gifts in foreign relations, as foreign countries also saw the value of silk. Because silk is one of nature's strongest natural fibers, it was deemed useful for many things other than fabric making. Silk was also used for strings of musical instruments and bows, as well as fishing lines. Silk cloth was even used as paper before the Chinese invented and spread the paper we know today. During the Han Dynasty, the quality of silk improved even further, becoming finer, stronger, and often with multicolored embroidered patterns and designs of human and animal figures. Chinese characters are also woven into the fabric of many surviving examples. The weave of some Han period pieces, with 220 warp threads per centimetre, is extremely fine. The cultivation of the silk worms themselves also became more sophisticated from the 1st century CE, with techniques used to speed up or slow their growth by adjusting the temperature of their environment. Different breeds were used, and these were crossed to create silkworms capable of producing threads with different qualities useful to the weavers. Weavers were usually women, and it was also their responsibility to make sure the silkworms were well fed on their favourite diet of chopped mulberry leaves and that they were sufficiently warm enough to spin thread for their cocoons. The industry became such a vital source of income for families that land dedicated to the cultivation of mulberry bushes was even made exempt from reforms which otherwise took away agricultural land from peasant ownership, and mulberry plots became the only land that it was possible for farmers to claim hereditary ownership of. Mencius, the Confucian philosopher, advocated the smallest of landholdings always set aside a plot to plant mulberry. As demand grew, then the state and those with enough capital to do so set up large workshops where both men and women worked. Great aristocratic houses had their own private silk production team with several hundred workers employed in producing silk for the estate's needs and for resale. Silk production even became the subject of poems. Eventually, The Chinese could no longer keep the lucrative secret of silk production to themselves, and it began to be manufactured in Korea and Japan, where it would become a state-controlled industry. Other states and cultures then acquired the skills of sericulture, such as India around 300 CE, and from there it spread to Byzantium, Arabia, the Levant, and Italy. The beauty of China's silk did not go unnoticed by the rest of the world. Although other countries did not yet know how to produce silk fabrics, archaeologists were able to uncover silk in the burial grounds of several old civilizations. This is thanks to China's trade activities. These civilizations include ancient Egypt, Persia, and the Greek and Roman empires. China already traded with some foreign countries before the founding of the Silk Route, but it was in the period after when silk really took the world by storm. The Silk Road was once the longest and most flourishing trade route in the world. The strong interest other countries showed in China's silk was one of the contributing causes to the opening of the Silk Road. Some 200 years AD, China was once isolated from the West by some of the world's toughest mountain and desert landscapes, until the founding of the Silk Road. The Silk Road was born when the Han government sent one of their generals west of China to establish trade relationships with foreign states. The road stretched over 6,000 kilometers, all the way from eastern China to the Mediterranean Sea. At the time, silk was one of the most valuable goods China had to offer. It was even considered to be more expensive than gold. Silk was seen as a luxurious good, thanks to its shimmer, lasting quality, and beautiful drape. As a result, lots of silk was traded or gifted in return for foreign products. As so much silk passed over this extraordinary trading route, it was later aptly named the Silk Route. While silk was one of China's most important trade goods, it was not the only one. China also had other valuable goods to offer the world, such as tea and paper. In return, they received gold, silver, horses, jewels, and much more. The Silk Route continued to contribute to the development of many major ancient societies until sea trade became more popular in the late Middle Ages. At this point, many countries had already learned how to produce their own silk. For thousands of years, China managed to keep a monopoly on silk production. The mulberry silkworm is native to China, and parts of China also have a favorable climate for growing mulberry trees. These two natural resources, along with the knowledge of sericulture, were needed to produce silk. The Chinese were serious about keeping their monopoly on silk making. They even enforced a ban on the transport of silkworms and their eggs to other countries. Anyone who disobeyed this ban could be faced with the death penalty. It was not until much later that the secrets of silk production left China. It is said that the Byzantine emperor hired monks to smuggle silkworm eggs out of China in 500 AD. These monks supposedly smuggled the eggs in their hollow bamboo walking canes, all the way from China to Constantinople. The monks were also said to bring along knowledge of sericulture. This was the first time a country other than China had access to silkworms and learned how to make silk fabrics. It is also likely that sericulture was spread by Chinese migrants who made a living of silk making abroad. Just like the Chinese, the Byzantines aimed to keep a monopoly on silk production after learning this precious art. With a monopoly, they were able to maximize their profits when trading silk. The Persians developed their own patterns and designs when weaving silk. However, it was said that Chinese silk was still superior in quality when compared to Byzantine silk. Thanks to its superior quality, Chinese silk remained popular despite the appearance of some healthy competition. After hundreds of years, around 630 AD, the Byzantines lost their monopoly on sericulture in their region. This was when the Arabs conquered Persia, where they discovered how to make silk. It took a while for other countries in the West to discover sericulture. It was not until the High Middle Ages that Andalusia in Spain and Venice in Italy took the lead in Europe's silk-making scene. During this time, around the year 1100, travelers from Constantinople set up their silk-making business in Italy. Today, the Como region in Italy is still renowned for its silk-making. Before silk-making became widespread in what is now known as Europe, its residents obtained silk by trading with China through the Silk Route. The ancient civilization of Rome loved wearing silk garments, and silk fashion was especially popular among societies rich and politically powerful. Back in East Asia, the Japanese also managed to obtain silkworm eggs and to learn the art of silk farming around 300 AD. It is said they brought over the eggs from China, along with several women skilled in sericulture. Silk became very popular in Japan as one of the main fabrics used in the making of kimonos. The kimono is a traditional garment in Japan, which was commonly worn on a day-to-day basis at the time. Silk lent itself well to kimono making, as it was easily dyed, and it gave the garments a luxurious, shimmering appearance. Japan would later become one of the world's largest silk producers, after China. Silk surely has a fascinating history, filled with fantastical tales. It remains one of the world's oldest natural fabrics. To this day, silk clothing, scarves, and even bedding remain incredibly popular. Silk has also managed to maintain its reputation as a luxurious fabric. Even in this modern age, silk remains one of the strongest and most long-lasting fabrics. Other than a few technological advances to speed up the production process, silk today is still roughly produced the same way as it was thousands of years ago. After millennia of experience in silk making, China remains the largest producer of silk in the world, with an output of 1.5 lakh metric tons of silk a year. Next time you wear something made of silk, take a moment to think about the fabric's impressive millennia-old history. In China, and later elsewhere, silk was used to make clothing, especially long robes, gowns and jackets, hand fans, furnishings, wall hangings, screens, decorative scenes for and from famous books and poems, military banners, funeral banners, Buddhist mandalas, and for the purposes of writing instead of bamboo or paper. Brightly coloured and exquisitely embroidered silk robes became a status symbol and helped distinguish officials and courtiers from the cotton or plain silk-wearing lower classes. In other cultures, such as Korea, there were even laws forbidding the wearing of silk by persons below a certain social rank. Embroidered silk became so varied and refined that a whole connoisseurship developed around the material, similar to that surrounding the fine porcelain of Chinese potters. Taoist priests were another group who were distinguished by their silk robes, often embroidered with ceremonial scenes. As a valuable commodity, bolts of silk were often used as a form of currency, especially in the payment of tribute, such as by the Northern Song and the Southern Song to the Liao and the Jin emperors, respectively. Silk was also an esteemed gift. Given to tributary states in appreciation of their loyalty, it was an impressive symbol of the Chinese emperor's great wealth and largesse. In 25 BCE alone, the Han gave as gifts an incredible 20,000 rolls of silk cloth. Traders used it as a payment, people paid their tax with it, and even armies were sometimes paid in silk. In art, silk became a popular surface on which to paint landscape scenes and portraits. Tang dynasty artists were particularly famed for their skills in dyeing, printing, and painting on silk, with many examples of their work surviving in Japan where they were sent as gifts. Silk books were made which had copies of famous paintings and so became reference albums for art connoisseurs. The trade of silk and other commodities along the Silk Road also brought with it ideas and cultural practices in both directions. Language and writing were especially important elements transmitted along the routes by traders, diplomats, monks, and travelers. Buddhism came to China from India and was then passed on to Korea and Japan. Explorers such as Marco Polo used the route, as did Christian missionaries from the West to enter China for the first time. New foodstuffs were introduced into China and then cultivated there, such as walnuts, pomegranates, sesame, and coriander. Silk, symbol of China for so long, had opened the doors to new lands and new ideas, and finally connected the great empires of the ancient world. Despite the popularity of silk, the secret of silk making reached Korea with technological aid from China, India by AD 440, and only reached Europe around AD 550 via the Byzantine Empire. Immigrants, monks, or merchants were smuggling silkworm eggs and cocoons and revealed the secret to make profit from it. The Byzantine silk industry was born, trying to compete with China. Although being of good quality, it struggled to compete, and Chinese silk was still the favorite among buyers in the Middle East and Europe. The Persians began to master silk art and developed their own techniques only in the 6th century. During the Crusades, in the 13th century, Italy started producing silk when it brought back skilled weavers from Constantinople. The pilgrimage, which refers to a journey made to a sacred place or for religious purposes, has been an integral aspect of human spirituality throughout history. In the Middle Ages, the concept of pilgrimage became a significant part of devotion for Christians in Europe. The practice was considered a powerful means of obtaining blessings, earning forgiveness, and seeking the intercession of saints. This article provides an insight into the early history of the pilgrimage during the Middle Ages, highlighting the motivations, destinations, and experiences of pilgrims during that period. During the Middle Ages, pilgrimage became a popular practice among Christians. Pilgrimage refers to a journey to a holy site or shrine undertaken for spiritual purposes. This sacred journey had a profound impact on individuals and communities in the Middle Ages, shaping their religious beliefs and practices. Pilgrims would travel long distances, sometimes risking their lives and facing various hardships, to pray, offer gifts, seek penance, or simply deepen their connection with God. The practice of pilgrimage was central to the Christian faith and played a significant role in the medieval society. It fostered a sense of community and shared identity among believers, provided economic opportunities for local businesses, and gave rise to the development of new forms of art, architecture, and literature. The term pilgrimage derived from the Latin word peregrinus, which meant foreigner or traveller. The concept of pilgrimage was deeply rooted in ancient religious traditions and cultures, and it grew in popularity during the Middle Ages due to the spread of Christianity and the rise of new religious orders. It is important to note that pilgrimage was not only a Christian phenomenon but also existed in other religions. Muslims, for instance, undertake the Hajj, a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. In summary, pilgrimage was a vital practice in the Middle Ages that shaped the spiritual and cultural landscape of Europe. The pilgrimage was an integral part of medieval life, as it held immense cultural, religious, and social significance. It was a way for people to show their devotion and strengthen their faith in God by visiting holy sites and relics. Additionally, the pilgrimage offered people an opportunity to escape their mundane lives and engage in spiritual reflection and self-discovery. Pilgrimages were also seen as a means of achieving redemption and forgiveness for sins and to seek blessings from saints. By embarking on a pilgrimage, people could enhance their social status and gain recognition among their peers as someone who performed an act of religious significance. Pilgrimages also played a crucial role in economic development as they stimulated trade and commerce across the pilgrimage routes. With the creation of numerous pilgrimage sites across Europe, abundant opportunities for artisans, traders, and innkeepers arose. Consequently, the massive influx of pilgrims also created a demand for food, accommodation, and transportation services, among other amenities. The significance of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages was not confined to spiritual or economic aspects. It also had political importance. Rulers and monarchs made an effort to establish new pilgrimage routes and build grand churches and cathedrals where holy relics were housed. This was done to evoke nationalism and bolster religious unity, as people came from wide-ranging regions to unite under the same religious fervor. Furthermore, the pilgrimage was utilized as a tool for diplomacy between different countries, fostering peaceful relations through mutual, cultural, and religious practices. The importance of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages extended beyond the religious and social realm. It paved the way for new ideas, artistic styles, and innovations. As people from different regions converged on pilgrimage routes, they shared their cultural experiences, leading to the exchange of ideas and the emergence of new artistic genres. The pilgrimage also saw the introduction of new technologies and systems of exchange, transforming economic practices and paving the way for economic development in medieval times. The influence of the pilgrimage was so massive that it continued to flourish even after the Middle Ages, leaving a lasting legacy that has impacted societies across generations. The journey on a pilgrimage in the Middle Ages was no simple feat. It required extensive travel arrangements, including finding accommodations and provisions for sustenance. Pilgrims were often in search of inexpensive and safe places to stay along the way, leading to the establishment of hospices and hostels. These lodgings were run by religious orders and were often located near churches, providing a place to rest, attend mass, and receive medical care. Despite the presence of these lodgings, the quality of accommodations was often poor, and there were limited resources available. This posed significant risks to pilgrims, as they faced the dangers of injury or illness, as well as theft or attack. In addition, the costs of the journey could be significant, with expenses typically including food, transportation, and fees for access to religious sites. Financing for the journey often fell on the pilgrims themselves, with many embarking on the journey with little to no money. These financial burdens were often seen as a test of faith, allowing the pilgrims to demonstrate their devotion and sacrifice. Overall, the challenges of travel and accommodation on a pilgrimage in the Middle Ages were significant, requiring pilgrims to navigate a complex system of resources and hazards, all while maintaining their faith and devotion to their religious beliefs. The early history of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages was not without its dangers and risks. Pilgrims often traveled long distances on foot, facing numerous physical challenges such as exhaustion, exposure to the elements, and the threat of robbery and violence from bandits along the way. Many pilgrims also fell ill due to the unsanitary conditions of the pilgrimage routes and the overcrowded accommodations. Furthermore, the risk of contracting diseases like dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera was high, and many pilgrims did not survive the journey. In addition to the physical dangers, pilgrims also faced spiritual dangers such as temptation, sin, and despair. The journey could be exhausting and emotionally draining, and some pilgrims lost their faith along the way. Despite these risks, the number of pilgrims continued to increase as more people sought spiritual fulfillment through these journeys. The pilgrims were willing to endure these risks, perhaps as a test of faith or as a way of demonstrating their devotion to God. Nevertheless, the risks were real, and many pilgrims never returned home. The pilgrimage was a significant undertaking that required significant financial resources. The cost of travel, accommodation, and sustenance during the pilgrimage could be a significant financial burden on the pilgrims. Pilgrims could save money for years to undertake the journey or sell their property and belongings to finance the pilgrimage. However, financial resources were not the only challenge for the pilgrims. Some pilgrimage routes were particularly treacherous, and pilgrims often fell prey to thieves along the way. They could lose their money or belongings. Therefore, the papacy and other religious institutions established an early system of finance to help pilgrims. Churches were built on the pilgrimage routes, where pilgrims could stay for free or at a minimal cost. In addition, monasteries also provided aid and shelter to pilgrims. They could also receive free food, clothing, or medical assistance. These institutions provided a substantial relief for pilgrims or the less fortunate. However, major benefactors were the wealthy or royalty. They funded the construction of these churches and monasteries as an act of charity or as a token of their devotion. Some also provided financial support to pilgrims. It was said that the granting of indulgence, the reduced amount of punishment one has to undergo for sins, to those that were heading for the Holy Land was a way to support them financially. Therefore, costs and financing were an essential element of the pilgrimage in the Middle Ages, and the church institution played a significant role in facilitating access to the sacred journey. The importance of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages extended beyond the religious and social realm. It paved the way for new ideas, artistic styles, and innovations. As people from different regions converged on pilgrimage routes, they shared their cultural experiences, leading to the exchange of ideas and the emergence of new artistic genres. The pilgrimage also saw the introduction of new technologies and systems of exchange, transforming economic practices and paving the way for economic development in medieval times. The influence of the pilgrimage was so massive that it continued to flourish even after the Middle Ages, leaving a lasting legacy that has impacted societies across generations. The pilgrimage to the Holy Land declined in the 13th and 14th centuries due to the rise of Islam and the increasing hostility between the East and the West. The fall of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, in 1291, marked the end of the pilgrimage era. However, the memory and legacy of the pilgrimage to the Holy Land continue to inspire and captivate pilgrims and scholars alike to this day. The pilgrimage to the Holy Land, also known as the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, was one of the most popular and significant pilgrimage destinations during the medieval era. This pilgrimage was primarily intended to visit the religious sites associated with the life of Jesus Christ, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Mount of Olives, and Bethlehem. The pilgrimage to the Holy Land was considered the most arduous and perilous of all pilgrimages because of the long journey by sea and land, the harsh living conditions, and the constant threat of bandits and pirates. The pilgrimage to the Holy Land was first initiated by Constantine the Great in the 4th century, who ordered the construction of several monumental churches and shrines in Jerusalem, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The popularity of the pilgrimage grew over the centuries as more and more Christians sought to see the holy sites and relics for themselves. The pilgrimage reached its peak in the 11th and 12th centuries, during which time thousands of pilgrims from all over Europe traveled to Jerusalem. Undertaking the pilgrimage to the Holy Land was not only a religious obligation, but also a status symbol for those who could afford it. The journey was expensive, and only the wealthy and influential members of society could afford to undertake it. However, for the less privileged, there were various ecclesiastical organizations, such as the Hospitallers and the Templars, which provided accommodations, protection, and medical aid to the pilgrims. During the pilgrimage, the pilgrims encountered not only the holy sites, but also other cultures and traditions. This exposure to new ideas and experiences played a significant role in the transmission of artistic, intellectual, and scientific knowledge from the East to the West. The pilgrimage to the Holy Land also had political ramifications, as it helped to foster closer ties between the European powers and the Eastern kingdoms, such as Byzantium and the Caliphate. The pilgrimage to the Holy Land declined in the 13th and 14th centuries due to the rise of Islam and the increasing hostility between the East and the West. The fall of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land in 12th century, marked the end of the pilgrimage era. However, the memory and legacy of the pilgrimage to the Holy Land continue to inspire and captivate pilgrims and scholars alike to this day. One of the most popular destinations for Christian pilgrims during the early Middle Ages was Rome. In fact, Rome was considered the ultimate destination for many pilgrims due to its significance as the center of the Christian world and the location of the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul. The pilgrimages to Rome during the Middle Ages were often long and arduous journeys, but the reward for completing them was immense. Pilgrims believed that their journey to Rome would grant them spiritual benefits, including the forgiveness of sins and the opportunity to gain merit in the eyes of God. The papacy also actively encouraged pilgrims to visit Rome, establishing special indulgences for those who made the pilgrimage, which further incentivized the faithful to make the journey. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela became one of the most important Christian pilgrimages during the Middle Ages. According to tradition, the relics of St. James the Great were discovered in the 9th century in Santiago de Compostela, and from then on, it became a major pilgrimage site. This pilgrimage is characterized by the tradition of walking the way of St. James, which usually took several weeks or even months to complete. The pilgrimage route began in France, and pilgrims traveled across the Pyrenees, making their way through northern Spain and eventually arriving in Santiago de Compostela. The pilgrimage was considered a transformative experience, and many believed that it would bring spiritual benefits, such as the forgiveness of sins. This pilgrimage attracted a diverse range of people, including the wealthy, the poor, the sick, and the healthy. The pilgrimage also had a significant economic impact on the towns and villages along the route. Many of these towns developed into important commercial centers as a result of the increased traffic from pilgrims. Moreover, the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela became a symbol of Christian unity, bringing together people from all over Europe. In the 12th century, the Codex Calixtinus was created, which was a guidebook for pilgrims that contained valuable information about the pilgrimage route, as well as liturgical texts and songs. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela continued to be popular until the Reformation, which led to a decline in the number of pilgrims. However, in recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in the pilgrimage, and it remains a popular spiritual journey for many Christians today. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem emerged as one of the most significant spiritual journeys in the Middle Ages. Jerusalem, known as the Holy City, held immense religious significance for the Christian faith. The first recorded pilgrimage to Jerusalem dates back to the 4th century, when Constantine organized such a journey to commemorate the life and death of Jesus Christ. Later, the Byzantine Empire constructed more places of worship, and Jerusalem became a major destination for European Christians. It was believed that a pilgrimage would enable a sinner to earn forgiveness and absolution for their sins, as well as strengthen their faith in God. In addition to the spiritual benefits, the pilgrimage also provided opportunities for economic, political, and social gain, thus attracting noblemen, merchants, and intellectuals. The journey to Jerusalem was often arduous, dangerous, and expensive, lasting for years and requiring participants to traverse vast territories and harsh terrains, such as deserts, forests, and mountains. The pilgrimage involved performing various religious rituals and ceremonies, such as attending masses, visiting shrines, and relics. The pilgrims also encountered different cultures, people, and languages, which expanded their worldview and provided new insights into the world. With the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the Christian pilgrimage became increasingly difficult and dangerous, as the new ruling caliphate restricted access to the holy sites in Jerusalem. However, this did not diminish the significance of Jerusalem for the Christian faith, and the pilgrimage continued to attract numerous participants, even during the Crusades. Overall, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem played a crucial role in the development of the Middle Ages society, culture, and economy, as well as in shaping the spiritual beliefs and practices of the Western world. The pilgrimage to Rome was one of the most prominent ones during the Middle Ages. Pilgrims traveled to Rome to visit the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul, gain indulgences for their sins, and seek papal blessings. The pilgrimage to Rome is believed to have begun as early as the 2nd century, when Christians in Rome visited the tombs of Peter and Paul. However, it wasn't until the 4th century when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity that it became safer for pilgrims to travel to Rome. During the 9th and 10th centuries, the pilgrimage to Rome became more popular due to the introduction of the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year was a special year declared by the Pope, where pilgrims could gain plenary indulgences for visiting the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul. It was during these years that Rome would be flooded with pilgrims from all around the world. The pilgrimage to Rome was also important for political and spiritual reasons. Many monarchs and other political leaders went on pilgrimage to Rome to strengthen their political ties with the Pope and show their allegiance to the Church. Along with political reasons, the pilgrimage to Rome had great spiritual significance as well. Pilgrims believed that by visiting the tombs of the saints, they could be closer to God and receive blessings to help them on their spiritual journey. The journey to Rome could be a dangerous one, with many dangers lurking along the way. Bandits, disease, and harsh weather were all hazards that pilgrims had to face. To make the journey safer, many towns along the way began to build hospitals, inns, and churches to accommodate and protect the pilgrims. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela was an important spiritual and cultural phenomenon in the Middle Ages. It began in the 9th century with the discovery of the tomb of St. James the Apostle in Galicia, Spain. The route to Santiago, also known as the Camino de Santiago, quickly became one of the most popular pilgrimage routes in Europe. Many believers embarked on this journey to expiate their sins, seek redemption, and gain spiritual rewards. The pilgrimage fostered cultural and commercial exchanges, resulting in the establishment of inns, hospitals, and monasteries along the way. The infrastructure built to support the pilgrimage helped to create a sense of unity among the people of Europe. The pilgrimage also had a profound impact on art and literature. Many churches and cathedrals along the route were adorned with beautiful sculptures, paintings, and mosaics depicting the story of St. James and other biblical scenes. Pilgrimage literature, such as the Codex Calixtinus, described the route to Santiago and provided information on the shrines and relics along the way. In the early Middle Ages, Canterbury became one of the most popular pilgrimage destinations for Christians in Europe. The site of the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Canterbury Cathedral attracted thousands of pilgrims every year from all over Europe. The Canterbury Tales, written by Geoffrey Chaucer in the 14th century, provide a glimpse into the world of pilgrims making their way to the cathedral. The importance of pilgrimage to Canterbury in the Middle Ages is evident in the numerous architectural and artistic works that were created to accommodate and honour the growing number of pilgrims. The Pilgrim's Way, a route that runs from Winchester to Canterbury, was established to provide pilgrims with a safe and well-marked path. The establishment of trade routes and the development of larger towns and cities along pilgrimage routes contributed to the growth of Canterbury as a centre of pilgrimage. The journey to Canterbury was not only a religious pilgrimage, but also a social and cultural event that provided a rare opportunity for people from different walks of life to come together and exchange ideas. Religious motivations formed the foundation for the pilgrimage movement in the Middle Ages. Christian pilgrims were driven by a desire to connect with their faith, seek forgiveness from God, and express their devotion. For many, pilgrimage was a means of atoning for sins and securing a better afterlife. It was also seen as an act of penance and a way to earn God's favour. The most popular destinations were holy sites in Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago de Compostela, where pilgrims could visit shrines, relics, and other sacred objects. The journey itself was seen as a religious act, with pilgrims often enduring great physical hardships like long distances, harsh weather, and dangerous roads. This was seen as a test of faith and a way to purify oneself before reaching the destination. Pilgrims often travelled in large groups, led by priests, carrying banners and singing hymns. They made stops at churches and monasteries along the way, where they received food, shelter, and spiritual guidance. Alongside religious motivations, social reasons played a crucial role in the early history of pilgrimages in the Middle Ages. Pilgrimages offered people the opportunity to socialize with others outside of their usual communities, creating a sense of belonging that contributed to their spiritual experiences. Additionally, they provided a platform for people to display their faith and piety, which elevated their social status within their communities. Individuals who undertook pilgrimages often did so in groups, which allowed them to form connections and support one another while sharing the journey. These groups also offered a degree of protection from the dangers of traveling alone, which included robbers, political unrest, and disease. Pilgrimage sites drew merchants and other entrepreneurial types who saw the potential for economic gain, which led to the development of services such as accommodation, food, and entertainment. Consequently, pilgrimages provided numerous networking and financial opportunities for people from all walks of life, regardless of their social status. 9th century France proved very lucrative for the Vikings. It was a land marred by civil war and bad harvests, and the Norsemen took advantage of this through raiding and mercenary acts. France's riverine system and innovations in the Viking longship allowed the Danes to penetrate deep into the continent and make a fortune in plunder from monasteries. Paris would be the ultimate target, and the Vikings besieged the city twice and received tribute payment in both cases. Why were the Vikings able to continuously successfully pillage France? Were the Frankish rulers inept, cowardly, or just practical in their handling of Norse incursions? Well before the Great Viking Siege of Paris, more than 300 islands dotted the length of the Seine River, reduced over the centuries by human impact and natural changes to slightly more than 100. During the Iron Age, the Celtic tribe of the Parisii made their home around a cluster of islands at the spot 4 miles downstream from where the Marne River joins the Seine. After conquering Gaul, the Romans built the city of Lutetia atop the ruins of the old Parisia settlement. Due to its location at an important road nexus, Lutetia grew in importance, becoming the capital of the Roman Western Gaul province by the end of the 4th century. For protection from barbarians migrating into Gaul, the Celts living along the banks of the Seine at Lutetia relocated to the 2 largest islands in the river, named the Isle de la Cité and the Isle de Saint-Louis. Using stones recovered from damaged buildings, the Romans built defensive walls on the 56-acre Isle de la Cité. The Isle de Saint-Louis, which was roughly half the size of the neighbouring island, was used mainly as pasture land and left undefended. The defensive walls largely followed the outline of the island. The builders attempted to place the walls as close as possible to the water's edge, but the marshy and muddy banks of the Isle de la Cité permitted only approximately half of the island to be enclosed. Due to the uneven terrain, the actual height of the walls varied from 12 to 25 feet, placing the top of the wall at roughly uniform level. 8 feet thick at the base, the walls tapered to 6 feet at the top. The Seine River with its swift current acted as a natural moat over which 2 bridges anchored on the Isle de la Cité connected the 2 sides of the river. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the name of the town reverted to Civitas de Parisius and was eventually shortened to Paris. During Charlemagne's reign, Paris became one of the most important cities of the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony in the late 8th century brought the borders of his empire into direct contact with Danish kingdoms. The collapse of centralized Danish monarchy around the beginning of the 9th century coincided with the explosion of Scandinavian expansion, which was spurred by the innovations in Scandinavian shipbuilding. Raids by Scandinavian pirates against Western Europe began in the late 8th century, with the attack on the holy island of Lindisfarne off the northwestern coast of England in 793, ushering in the Viking Age. The term Vikings, as we know, it appears to have originated in the 18th century. Their Western contemporaries typically referred to Scandinavian pirates and raiders as the Norse or the Danes. In Eastern Europe, the Vikings were typically called the Russ in reflection of their Swedish origin. Lasting until the end of the 11th century, Viking raids took place over a vast territory from the Western European seaboard to the Black and Caspian Seas in the east and the Mediterranean Sea in the south. Sailing the inshore waters of the North and Celtic Seas and the English Channel, the Vikings were within easy striking distance of rich targets in the British Isles and Western Europe. The Vikings built shallow draft vessels known as longships. They used their longships not only at sea, but also to penetrate large land masses by rowing them upriver. The longships, which could pass through water just a few feet deep, were light enough to be portaged short distances when necessary. The symmetrical design of the Viking boats allowed them to reverse course without turning, a feature especially useful within the relatively narrow confines of a river. With emphasis on speed and maneuverability, the main source of propulsion was by oar, but a square sail was added when traveling on the open sea. The Vikings initially raided in 1 to 3 ships. However, as they grew in power and their raids became more ambitious, their fleets grew to as many as 200 longships. But these great fleets were the exception rather than the rule. Due to the shallow hull construction of their ships, the Vikings could land directly on the beaches or riverbanks. This allowed rapid egress and prepared the Norsemen to strike where they were least expected. After initially raiding coastal areas, the Vikings began penetrating deeper inland using rivers as highways. Raiding was a young man's business, a sort of rite of passage to earn reputation and wealth. Once having started a family, the majority of former Vikings settled down to farming, the primary means of earning a living in Scandinavia. The Icelander Egil's saga describes its Viking protagonist, Egil Skallagrimsson, as conducting both trading and raiding. Virtually all Viking activities depended on exploration and navigation of seas and rivers. Shipbuilding was expensive, and only rich men like kings and earls could afford to build or buy and outfit a ship or fleet of ships. Those with lesser means could buy a share in a longship, while those without means served as warriors or crewmen. During the heyday of the Viking Age, a typical force of Norse raiders consisted of approximately 400 men. Large fleets usually did not have central command, being a conglomeration of warbands with their own leaders. Operating in the manner of modern-day commandos, they avoided pitched battles with local forces in favor of quick, hard strikes against specific targets and fading away before local response could be organized. When forced to fight in an open field and with the battle going against them, a Viking warband would give way and scatter, avoiding crippling losses and reforming at a different location. In 882, a relief force of Franks pursued the Vikings, who betook themselves to a wood and scattered hither and yon, and finally returned to their ships with little loss, according to the Annals of St. Vast, a collection of historical records produced in the 10th century by the Abbey of St. Vast in Arras. When staying in one location for a period of time, the Vikings encamped on river islands or on easily defensible riverbanks. Since longships were not designed to carry horses, the Norsemen captured or bought horses from local residents. The horses allowed them to raid deep inland. The main goal of a Viking raid was to carry off portable valuables and slaves. It was a common tactic for Vikings to demand tribute of gold, silver, or foodstuffs in exchange for sparing a town from looting. After gathering plunder in one place, the Vikings frequently sailed to another location. Here they would trade their loot with the locals and return to raiding farther down the line. The Vikings regularly targeted churches and monasteries because they held considerable wealth. The well-known vulnerability of religious institutions made them attractive targets. In the course of plundering these ecclesiastical institutions, the Norsemen would indiscriminately slaughter monks and clerics. While Christian combatants, for the most part, left churches and holy sites unmolested, the pagan Norsemen harbored no such inhibitions. The first Viking attack against Charlemagne's empire came in 799. Charlemagne responded by establishing a defensive system the following year north of the Seine estuary. The Franks fortified key coastal locations and conducted regular ship patrols in river estuaries. This initially helped prevent Viking river raids. After Charlemagne's death in 814, his empire was divided among his three sons. The power struggle among his progeny prevented the Franks from bringing the full weight of their defensive resources against the Viking menace. By the middle of the 9th century, the Vikings had firm control of large parts of France's northern coast and regularly raided along the Seine and Loire rivers. The Vikings eventually began colonizing large swaths of territory in the lands they regularly raided. They built settlements in England, Ireland, the Netherlands, Scotland, and northern France beginning in the 9th century. Local rulers frequently made treaties with strong Viking chieftains, bestowing land grants and hiring Viking mercenaries. In some internecine clashes between Frankish domains, Viking warbands served on both sides. The Vikings established a particularly strong presence in Neustria, the northwestern Frankish territory that extended from the Loire River to the south of modern Belgium. A powerful Viking chieftain named Rollo controlled the Seine estuary and territory as much as 50 miles inland. This put Paris within easy striking distance. The first Viking attack on Paris came in 845 under the war chief Reginerus. After plundering the city, the Vikings withdrew after King Charles II, the Bald of West Francia, paid an exorbitant ransom of almost £5,200 in gold and silver. The Vikings returned 3 more times in the 860s, but withdrew after being bought off with sufficient bribes while looting the surrounding countryside and burning churches. Charles eschewed battle with the Vikings. Instead, he channeled his resources toward the construction of fortifications along the Seine and other rivers that would prevent the passage of Viking longships. In his Edict of Pistres in 864, the King of West Francia detailed the need to strengthen key locations in France against the raids. He ordered fortified bridges constructed at all towns on major rivers to prevent Viking longships from passing beyond them. In addition, Charles the Bald revamped the lantry system under which all able-bodied men were required to report for service against the invaders. The king forbade his people from trading in arms and horses with the Norsemen. He made selling or trading horses with the Vikings a crime punishable by death. The pattern of Viking raids changed by the time another large host of Norsemen arrived at Paris in 885. King Alfred's last Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex in Great Britain withstood the Viking onslaught, while large parts of the kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia were divided between powerful Viking leaders, forming an extensive swath of territory called the Danelaw. With no new profitable territory to conquer, those Viking warbands yet to gain their fortune turned their attention to the European continent. A large coalition of Viking forces assembled in the territory controlled by Rollo in July 885 in preparation for a large-scale campaign against West Francia. The main forces belonged to Rollo and Earl Sigfrid, another powerful chieftain, who were joined by several smaller bands. Neither Rollo nor Sigfrid was in overall command of the assembled host. The combined Viking forces first sacked Rouen, after which they advanced against Pont de l'Arche, a fortified bridge on the Seine River 10 miles southeast of the city. A small body of Frankish troops under the command of Count Ragnold, Margrave of Neustria, assembled at the bridge to oppose the Vikings. The Vikings soundly defeated the Franks at Pont de l'Arche on July 25, 885. Ragnold was slain in the sharp clash. On the move again in early November, after solidifying their hold on Rouen, the Vikings advanced overland and by river to the fortified bridge where the Oise River joins the Seine. Easily capturing the bridge on the Oise, the Vikings continued to Paris. As they drew closer to Paris, the locals began fleeing their homes to safety deeper inland or taking shelter behind the walls of Paris on the Isle de la Cité, bringing their valuables and foodstuffs with them. Among the refugees taking shelter in Paris was a young Benedictine monk named Abbo Sernuus. Abbo was a monk at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. He came from the region between the Seine and the Loire and was in Paris during the siege. A decade later, Abbo wrote an extensive Latin poem called Bella Parisiaque Urbis, describing the events that unfolded at Paris in 885 to 886. While the verse is at times exaggerated, flowery, and grandiloquent, Abbo nonetheless supplies many crucial details about events that could only have been provided by a witness. Arriving before Paris on or about November 25th, 885, the Vikings under Rollo and Sigfrid found their way upriver barred by two low-slung fortified bridges. The shorter bridge, the Petit Pont, which linked the island to the south bank, was constructed of wood. Its bridgehead was fortified by the Petit Châtelet, a wooden tower. The longer, northern span, known as the Grand Pont, was made out of stone, with crenellations along its length. Its bridgehead was defended by the stone Grand Châtelet, which was only partially completed. Nevertheless, its foundations were solid and stood firmly grounded. Catapults and ballistae mounted on city walls could take under fire any ship attempting to reach the Isle de la Cité along either channel of the Seine River. Count Odo of Paris and Bishop Goslin of Saint-Denis directed the defense of Paris on behalf of King Charles. Odo was an experienced warrior whose father, Robert the Strong, Count of Anjou, was killed on July 2nd, 866, in a clash with a force of Viking Breton raiders at Bressarth on the right bank of the Loire. Goslin had no love for the Vikings, having been captured in 858 with his younger brother Louis. The Norsemen released their captives upon payment of a substantial ransom. The force defending Paris was a meagre one. In addition to a handful of nobles, there were approximately 200 troops, according to Abbo. He was most likely only counting men-at-arms trained for war. With this in mind, there might also have been lightly armed spearmen and crossbowmen from the local militia. These men would have handled mundane tasks such as standing watch and hauling supplies. When it became apparent the Vikings were threatening Paris itself, preparations began in earnest. For very hastily arrows were being sharpened, repaired, forged, and bucklers were all sorted out. Even old arms were restored, wrote Abbo. 700 high-prowed ships and very many smaller ones, along with an enormous multitude of smaller vessels, sailed up the Seine, carrying 40,000 Norsemen, according to Abbo. A more accurate estimate, though, is that the Viking army consisted of 12,000 men travelling in 300 ships. Rather than demanding tribute from Paris, Rollo and Sigfrid initially requested free passage up the Seine River. "Give us your consent that we might go our way, well beyond this city," they purportedly said. "Nothing in it shall we touch, but shall preserve and safeguard." To add weight to their request, the Vikings threatened to attack Paris if free passage was refused. Co-commanders Odo and Goslin, unfazed by the threats, flatly refused to accommodate the Vikings. Having been refused passage, the Vikings attacked on November 26th. They sought to overwhelm the defenders in a single, furious assault. Vikings armed with swords and axes assailed the towers guarding the two bridges. They were supported by Viking archers in the longships on the river who showered the defenders with arrows. Another large body of Vikings landed on the Isle de la Cité and attempted to scale the city walls. Furious fighting erupted all around the city, especially at the towers. Braving Viking archers in the boats, defenders rushed reinforcements to the towers. Especially heavy fighting broke out at the Grand Chatelet. Unable to break down the gates, a group of Vikings attacked the base of the tower with picks. The defenders served them up with oil and wax and pitch, which was all mixed up together and made into hot liquid on a furnace, wrote Abbo. Engulfed in flames, Vikings struck by the fire writhed on the ground, while others jumped in the river to extinguish the flames. More Vikings joined the fight at the Grand Chatelet as defenders fired arrows and dropped stones on the crowd of attackers at the bottom of the tower. After several hours of fighting in which they failed to gain a foothold in any place, the Vikings withdrew. They fell back, taking their dead with them. The Vikings had some female family members with them on the campaign, and the women began heckling their men for retreating. A number of Vikings renewed the attack against the Grand Chatelet and attempted to set its gate on fire, as their rude mouths drove them to make their own domed furnace near the bottom of the tower, wrote Abbo. The attackers made a breach in the tower's foundation, but were not able to break in against the defenders' determined resistance. Likewise, the Vikings attacking the walls on the Isle de la Cité boarded their ships and withdrew. The defenders completed the upper story of the Grand Chatelet during the night using wooden planks. During the next several days, the Vikings cut down a large tree, which they fashioned into a battering ram mounted on a wheeled frame with overhead cover. Once the ram was completed, the Vikings advanced against the Grand Chatelet, taking cover under the ram frame's overhead protection and behind its large wheels. At the same time, more Vikings landed from their ships on the island and attacked the city walls. Both Count Odo and Bishop Goslin were in the thick of the fighting. They shouted encouragement to their men. Their very presence prevented panic. Goslin, firing a bow from the city wall, was lightly wounded by a Viking arrow. Despite their best efforts, the second Viking attack against Paris failed as well. Recognizing that Paris could not be taken by storm, the Vikings settled in for a protracted siege and began raiding deeper into the countryside for provisions. In early December, they established a permanent camp on the right side of the river in the area of the modern-day suburb of Saint-Denis. Their camp was protected by stone and earth ramparts and a deep ditch bristling with sharpened stakes. After looting the abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the Vikings turned it into a stable for their horses. They also established an outpost on the left side of the river to blockade the Petit Chatelet. Like a horde of locusts, the Vikings stripped the countryside. In the process, they indiscriminately killed local residents who had the misfortune of falling into their hands. The Danes ransacked and despoiled, massacred and burned and ravaged. The men in arms, in their keenness to flee, sought out the woods. No one stayed to be found. Everyone fled. The people of the countryside put up no opposition to the Vikings, allowing them to plunder at will. The Danes took away on their ships all that was splendid in this good realm, all that was the pride of this famous region. As the Great Siege of Paris wore on, the Vikings constructed 2 additional rams and began building siege weapons that called as mangonels and catapults. They also removed a belfry from one of the churches and used it as a mobile tower, shooting arrows from its slits. The Franks attempted to interfere with these efforts by firing their own defensive weapons at the Vikings. Then from the tower was launched a javelin, shot with great force and accuracy. Whether the Vikings had siege engines is subject to debate. They likely had been exposed to siege engines in the course of their various campaigns against the Anglo-Saxons and Franks. Owing to the shallow draft of their longships and their initial intentions to raid farther upriver, it is highly unlikely that Rollo and Sigfrid brought siege artillery with them. Instead, they would have detailed work parties to construct them on site. The siege weapons the Vikings built during the siege would have been of simple design and not the torsion-powered onagers or ballistas capable of knocking down stone walls. Such weapons did not arrive in northern Europe until the late 12th century. Most fortifications in the early medieval era were made of earth and wood and would typically be brought down by fire and mining. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the skills of siege engine building in Europe largely fell into disuse, and only the crudest forms existed. The siege engines known to the Vikings were most likely descendants of Roman field artillery pieces, basically slinging Perrier engines and giant crossbows, for no engine in the medieval period depended upon torsion power. The term mangonel is derived from the Greek maganon, meaning engine of war. The term is frequently used interchangeably with any stone-throwing catapult, including the onager and ballista. Once the Vikings had constructed a number of siege weapons, they launched another attack. Into the city, they hurled 1,000 pots of molten lead, and the turrets on the bridges were knocked down by the catapults. The new attack, both along the bank and from the river, was against the Grand Chatelet and the Grand Pont. The Vikings attacking the Grand Chatelet formed a testudo. They advanced behind painted shields held up above to form a life-preserving vault. Not one of them dared lift his head out from under it, and yet underneath they felt constant blows. The defenders again rushed to the threatened areas, and defensive fire was taking a great toll on the attackers. No path to the city was left unstained by the blood of men. Numerous Frankish monks from the despoiled monasteries fought among the Paris defenders, an incident during the attack when a Viking warrior was struck in the mouth by an arrow. A second man rushed to help him and was struck down in turn, and then a third man succumbed to the same fate before their comrades formed a wall of shields around them and pulled them to safety under the covering fire of their own archers. You will surprise that the Viking arrows were poisoned. Yes, poisoned. After several hours of fighting, this attack petered out as well. Periodic attacks continued through December and into January 886, primarily directed against the Grand Chatelet. In the lull between the assaults, the defenders dug ditches around the tower, reducing the usefulness of the Vikings' rams by making it difficult to drag them into position. To ease the approach of the rams, one group of Vikings would attack the tower, while others began filling in ditches with debris, animal carcasses, and the corpses of captured Franks. To further counteract the battering rams, the defenders constructed so-called ram catchers that they used to immobilize the ram's log. Hefty shafts of hard wood, each one pierced at the far end with a keen tooth of iron, with which to strike rapidly at the siege engines of the Danes. The Viking assaults also came under fire from Frankish heavy weapons. For their part, the Franks also constructed mangonels using thick planks. These instruments of death and destruction shot forth great, massive stones that landed cruelly, smashing utterly the humble shelters of the vile Danes. The brains of those wretches were battered out of their skulls. Failing to take the Grand Chatelet, the Vikings undertook a new tactic against the Grand Pont Bridge. They portaged 3 ships a short distance around the city on February 2nd, 886, and placed them back in the water upriver. The Vikings then loaded these ships with firewood and set them ablaze. Spewing flames, these ships began to drift from east to west. They were guided and pulled by taut ropes along the riverbank. The enemy hoped either to burn the bridge or the tower. The fire ships rammed into a high heap of stones so that no harm came to the bridge, wrote Abbo. The defenders put out the fires with water from the river and then kept the hulks to use as they saw fit. During the attack against the bridge, the Vikings left the rams unguarded, so the Franks sallied forth from the Grand Chatelet tower and captured and destroyed 2 of them. The siege of Paris dragged on through the winter, with rains adding to the misery of the besiegers huddled in their camps. During the night of February 6th, the rain-swollen Seine River overflowed its banks, and the bridge supports of the wooden Petit Pont failed, leaving the Petit Chatelet tower isolated on the left bank. The following morning, the Vikings launched a strong attack against the vulnerable wooden tower, which was defended by just a dozen Franks. Braving the defenders' arrows, the Vikings pushed a wagon loaded with hay against the tower and set it ablaze. Despite the defenders' attempts to suppress it, the fire spread, forcing the Franks to retreat to the remnants of the destroyed bridge. The defenders formed a small shield wall bristling with swords at the bridgehead and braced for a fight to the death. The Vikings promised to spare them if the Franks surrendered to be held for ransom. Faced with certain death otherwise, the 12 defenders laid down their arms. Believing a Frank named Erevius to be a person of some importance, the Vikings bound him with ropes with the intention of ransoming him. The others, not so fortunate, were put to the sword by their captors. Seeing his comrades being slaughtered, Erevius demanded to share their fate. The Vikings obliged him by slaying him the following day. They then tore down the remains of the burned tower and flung the bodies of the slaughtered defenders into the river. With the obstacle of the Petit Pont removed, restless Earl Sigfrid took his men on a major operation up the Seine River, raiding over a wide swath of the Frankish interior south of Paris, from Troyes to Le Mans. Believing the Viking camp on the right bank abandoned, Abbot Ebolus from the St. Denis monastery sallied across Grand Pont with a small troop of soldiers intending to destroy the camp and free his despoiled home. But Rollo and his men were still in the camp, and Ebolus had to beat a hasty retreat back to Paris. With the numbers of besiegers reduced by Siegfried's departure and the environs of Paris being sparsely patrolled, Count Odo was able to send several messengers through enemy lines with requests for relief. He appealed for help to Holy Roman Emperor Charles the Fat, who was campaigning in Italy, and his senior military commander, Count Heinrich of Fulda. As the Margrave of Saxony, Heinrich was the senior Carolingian commander in East Francia and had led several successful campaigns against the Vikings in the recent past. Responding to Odo's call for relief, Count Heinrich arrived at the siege of Paris in March 886. He and his men were exhausted from having made a forced march in inclement weather. Heinrich led his Frankish troops in a surprise night attack against the Viking camp but was thrown back. After a few more days of desultory skirmishing, Heinrich withdrew to Saxony. Shortly after Count Heinrich's departure, Siegfried returned to Paris and added his men to the siege. Heinrich's unsuccessful attempt to lift the siege and Siegfried's return had an understandably adverse effect on the defenders' morale. In late March, Odo and Goslin were forced to enter into negotiations with the Viking leaders. However, the negotiations with Odo fell apart when the Vikings made an unsuccessful attempt to kidnap him during the talks. Despite this, Goslin continued negotiations and reached a separate agreement with Siegfried. The agreement stipulated that the church would pay Siegfried 60 pounds of silver to vacate the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés and quit the siege of Paris. Abbo seems to have differentiated in his account between the church's ecclesiastical authority and Odo's administrative authority. Goslin's tribute came at an opportune time, for the Vikings did not have the temperament for long sieges, and their morale had dipped considerably. After taking possession of the silver, Siegfried led his warriors farther inland in search of more plunder. Rollo continued his siege of Paris because he wanted to establish a permanent presence on the Seine River. He undertook another assault against the Grand Châtelet, but it was repulsed. As the siege dragged on, the situation inside Paris became dire, with an outbreak of plague carrying away many Parisians. One of them was Goslin, who succumbed to the plague on April 16, 886. In late May 886, Odo himself slipped out of Paris, leaving Abbot Ebolus in charge of the defences. Under command of the fighting abbot, the defenders conducted frequent nighttime sallies against Viking sentries and outposts, and sometimes brought back prisoners who were executed after being questioned. Count Odo returned to Paris in June 866 with a small body of fresh troops and some supplies coming up from the direction of Montmartre. The Danes attempted to block his approach, but aided by a sally from the Grand Châtelet, Odo and his men were able to fight through to Paris. The Vikings launched sporadic attacks against Paris throughout the summer and well into the autumn. King Charles the Fat arrived in October 886 with a large body of troops drawn from various lands. To the chagrin of the Paris defenders, the king did not attack the Vikings but established his own camp on the heights of Montmartre and entered into negotiations with Rollo. Charles the Fat promised Rollo 700 pounds in silver to share with Siegfried if he were to lift the siege and withdraw. Since the sum was significant, Charles requested until March of 887 to gather the money. In the meantime, Charles promised the Vikings free passage to pillage the Duchy of Burgundy, which was in revolt against his authority. After campaigning for several months in Burgundy, during which time they unsuccessfully besieged Sens, Rollo and Siegfried returned to Paris in late 886. True to his word, King Charles paid the tribute, and the Vikings finally withdrew from Paris. Siegfried moved on to Friesland, where he was later killed in battle. Rollo fared much better. In addition to the monetary tribute, Charles the Fat gave Rollo a land grant along the lower Seine River. Rollo made Rouen his base. While similar land grants to other Viking chieftains eventually reverted to the locals, Rollo's land grant remained in effect. The territory under his control was known as the Land of the Norsemen, who became known as Normans. This region soon became the Duchy of Normandy. Rollo's progeny and followers became more French than Danish, and Rollo's direct descendant William the Conqueror came to rule England in the 11th century. King Charles the Fat, loathed by Frankish nobles and notables for the shameful capitulation to the Vikings, died on January 13, 888. Count Odo, whose reputation had been enormously enhanced by his role in the defense of Paris, was elected king shortly afterward by the nobles of the realm. Odo was crowned king of West Francia in February 888. When a Viking force threatened Paris that summer, Odo's troops defeated it at Montfaucon Forest on June 24, 888. Over the course of the next quarter century, Viking warbands appeared in the vicinity of Paris several more times, but they never attacked the city. To the Romans, barbarians were not just foreign enemies, but fearsome innovators of war, wielding weapons that often proved brutally effective on ancient battlefields. From axes that shattered shields to bows that could pierce armor at astonishing range, these tools reflected distinct fighting styles shaped by culture, terrain, and tactics. Here are 7 of the most formidable weapons and technologies that helped barbarian warriors challenge, and sometimes overwhelm, the world's greatest empire. Few barbarian weapons inspired more horror than the axe. While most tribal warriors carried spears or swords into combat, Germanic soldiers were known to wield heavy battle axes capable of smashing through shield, armor, and helmet in a single blow. The Franks, meanwhile, were partial to a lightweight axe known as a francisca, which could be used as a hacking weapon or hurled at close range as a projectile. The iron head of this weapon was thick and exceedingly sharp on both sides, while wooden handle was very short. The historian Procopius wrote of the francisca in the 6th century AD, and they are accustomed always to throw these axes at one signal in the first charge and shatter the shields of the enemy and kill the men. The axe was one of the many barbarian weapons that carried over into the medieval world. It was particularly popular among the Varangian Guard, a band of Viking mercenaries who served as bodyguards for Byzantine emperors in the 10th and 11th centuries. Barbarian tribes were sometimes known to rush into battle stark naked to intimidate their enemies, but they also possessed a wide range of shields and armor. Among the most effective was chainmail, which may have been invented in Europe by the Gallic Celts in the 3rd century BC. Most Gallic mail took the form of a short-sleeved shirt or vest made from an interlocking mesh of small metal rings. This provided flexibility, while also protecting the wearer from slashing blows by swords and daggers, which would simply glance off its hard outer surface. Chainmail was extremely labor-intensive to make. A single vest might include tens of thousands of rings, so it tended to be worn by barbarian chieftains and aristocrats rather than rank-and-file soldiers. Nevertheless, its effectiveness in combat made it highly prized among the Romans, who eventually adopted a similar mail shirt known as the lorica hamata for their legions. The double-edged long sword was the main weapon of the Gauls, a collection of Celtic tribal peoples that inhabited what is now France, Belgium, and Western Germany. Unlike the shorter Roman gladius, which was primarily a stabbing weapon, the iron swords employed by the Gauls were designed to hack and slash at the enemy in a downward stroke resembling an axe blow. The swords tended to be less effective on packed battlefields where there was not as much room to maneuver, but they were particularly deadly in individual and guerrilla combat. The barbarians preferred tactics. The long sword figured prominently in the many wars fought between the Gauls and the Roman Republic. When the Gallic chieftain Brennus invaded Italy in the 4th century BC, his troops famously used their sabres to cut through enemy shields and rout a Roman army along the river Allia. They went on to carry out a grisly sack of the city of Rome. During his campaigns in Britain in 55 and 54 BC, Julius Caesar became the first Roman general to encounter the war chariots of the native Celtic tribes. These vehicles were usually 2-horse affairs with iron-rimmed wheels and sturdy platforms made of wicker and wood. In combat, they functioned as a kind of ancient personnel carrier. Drivers would drop a lone warrior near the fighting, race to safety, and then return to pick the soldier up if he was injured or needed to withdraw. They drive about in all directions and throw their weapons and generally break the ranks of the enemy with the very dread of their horses and the noise of their wheels, Caesar wrote. And when they have worked themselves in between the troops of horse, leap from their chariots and engage on foot. The British chariot later took a starring role in the 60 AD revolt of the warrior queen Boudica, who united several Celtic tribes against the Romans. While she succeeded in razing 3 Roman Britain cities, her war charioteers were eventually hemmed in and slaughtered at the Battle of Watling Street. When the Romans invaded modern-day Spain in 218 BC, they came face to face with a barbarian tribe known as the Celtiberians. These warriors were renowned both for their guerrilla fighting ability and their skill as swordsmiths and metalworkers. One of their most famous weapons was the falcata, a curved, 2-foot-long steel sword that was single-edged near the hilt and double-edged near the point. The weapon was weighted towards the tip, which allowed it to slash or stab its way through armor with relative ease. It was even known to cut Roman swords clean in half. The falcata served the barbarians well during more than 200 years of warfare with Rome, and it was highly prized by the ancient general Hannibal, who equipped Carthaginian troops with it during the Second Punic War. Celtiberian weapons also proved influential for the Romans. After encountering superior Spanish steel, they adapted a Celtiberian short sword into the famed gladius of the Roman legions. In the 5th century AD, Attila and his Hun steppe marauders invaded Europe from the east and cut a bloody swath across the Roman Empire. The Scourge of God and his Huns shocked Westerners with their maneuverable cavalry and hit-and-run tactics, but they also possessed a formidable new weapon, the recurve bow. Most Hun warriors carried composite bows assembled from wood, sinew, horn, and bone. Unlike the Western bow, these steppe weapons were made to curve back on themselves at the ends, which generated added torque and made arrows fly with enough velocity to penetrate armor at 100 yards. They were also smaller than typical bows, making them easier to wield on horseback. Hun horse archers were famed for their ability to accurately fire their bows even while at a full gallop. In battle, they often ambushed their adversaries in scattered bands, unleashing devastating hails of arrows before riding back to safety. Once the enemy was weakened, the Huns would swarm them at close range and finish the job with spears, sabers, and even lassos. Unlike most barbarian groups, the Huns were particularly proficient at siege warfare. They first gained insight on siege technology while serving as Roman auxiliaries, and they may have also relied on Roman prisoners and deserters to help them build war machines. According to the chronicler Priscus of Panium's description of the 443 AD siege of Nisus, the Huns used massive, wheeled siege towers to move protected archers close to the battlements and rain arrows onto the city's defenders. They also pummeled the city's walls with huge battering rams, which Priscus described as a beam with a sharp metal point suspended on chains hung loosely from a V-shaped timber frame. The Huns' siege weapons helped them all but obliterate Nisus, and they went on to capture several other Roman fortress cities including Serdica, Philippopolis, and Arcadiopolis. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II brought an end to the destruction by paying out a hefty tribute, but it wasn't long before Attila the Hun launched another deadly campaign, this time against Western Europe and Italy.